My name is Cristina Medeiros, and I am 37 years old, and I gave my father a kidney on a Tuesday in March. Nobody at the table knew what that had cost me. Or rather, they knew, and they had quietly decided it did not matter. 3 weeks after the surgeon closed the incision along my left side, my mother stood up at the head of the table, lifted a glass of vinho verde, and looked past me as if I were an empty chair. "Thank God for Amber," she said. "Without your sister, we would be picking out a casket for your father right now." I was still wearing the compression band under my sweater, and I could feel the staples pull every time I breathed. I did not correct her. I did not stand. I did not cry. I did not throw the bread basket across the room the way the old me might have wanted to. I picked up my fork, I cut a small piece of the roast my aunt had made, and I chewed it slowly, while 30 relatives raised their glasses to the one daughter who had refused to be tested. What none of them knew, what my sister especially did not know, was that I had spent those 3 weeks doing something other than resting. I had been making copies. Every record has a timestamp. Every signature has a date. And a hospital does not lie about whose body a kidney came out of. There would be another dinner, 6 days later, at a restaurant on Duval Street, with a new ring on my sister's finger, and her fiancé smiling beside her. That was the night the story my mother had spent 20 years building finally ran out of floor to stand on. But to understand how one toast became the most expensive sentence my sister ever let my mother say, you have to go back to the fall my father started dialysis, and the cold Saturday, my sister looked a nurse in the eye and said no. We grew up in a gray 3-family house on Rodman Street, 3 floors of the same family stacked on top of each other, with my grandmother on the first floor until she passed. My father, Manuel, bought that house in 1979 for $31,000, back when the mills were closing, and nobody in Fall River thought the property would ever be worth anything. He was a machinist by trade, and he worked 40 years at a shop off Pleasant Street, and he came home every night smelling of cutting oil and cheap coffee. My mother, Fatima, cleaned houses across the river in Tiverton, and she raised us in between, and she made her decisions about who we were before either of us could argue. By the time I was 10, the roles were set like poured concrete. My sister Amber was the bright one, the pretty one, the one who lit up a room the second she walked into it. I was the one who could be counted on to carry the plates back to the kitchen. Amber is 5 years younger than me, and from the day she was born, my mother treated her like a small miracle who had wandered into a tired house. She was named for nothing in particular, just a name my mother liked from a television show. I was named Cristina, after my father's mother, the grandmother on the first floor, and I used to think that meant I belonged to the old part of the family, the part that worked and waited, and did not complain. The pattern never changed. It only got more expensive. When Amber wanted to try cosmetology school and then quit, my parents paid for both. When I wanted to take a medical billing course at the community college, my father told me I was smart enough to figure it out on my own, and I did, at night, while working days at a clinic on Highland Avenue. I have spent 14 years in medical records and insurance billing, which means I read charts, I chase signatures, and I keep copies of everything, because in my work, a missing document is the difference between a bill that gets paid and a family that gets destroyed. Remember that about me. It matters later. Amber became a real estate agent at 24, and for a while she was good at it, and my mother told the whole parish that her youngest was going to buy us all houses someday. Amber knew deeds. She knew titles. She knew how a name gets added to a property, and she knew which notary in the city would sign almost anything for a friend. I did not think of that skill as a weapon back then. I only thought my sister sold condos. My father started getting tired in the fall of the year he turned 66. He blamed it on his age, then on the coffee, then on the weather. My Aunt Odette, his older sister, the one who moved into the first floor after my grandmother died, was the one who finally dragged him to the doctor in November. The word they came home with was one none of us wanted to hear: polycystic kidney disease, both kidneys failing, the same thing that had quietly taken his own mother years before. By January, he was on dialysis 3 mornings a week, 4 hours a session, at a center on North Main Street, and I drove him most of those mornings, because Amber said the early hours interfered with her showings. The doctors explained it plainly. Dialysis could keep him alive, but a living donor kidney would give him years, instead of a slow decline, so they asked the family to get tested. My mother was too old, and had her own heart trouble. My aunt was ruled out for high blood pressure. That left 2 daughters, Amber and me, and for a few weeks in that cold kitchen on Rodman Street, it almost felt like maybe, for once, we would face something together. If you have ever sat in a hospital hallway, waiting to find out whether your body can save someone you love, you already know the particular silence of that kind of waiting, and I would like to know where you are listening from tonight, because stories like this one tend to find the people who have lived some version of them. If any of this is starting to feel familiar, stay with me, because what my family did next is the whole reason I am telling it at all. I got tested first, because that is who I am, and I did not tell anyone until the results came back. My blood type matched. The preliminary cross-match looked promising. I remember standing in the parking lot of the clinic on Highland Avenue, reading the message on my phone, feeling something I can only describe as terrified relief. I could do it. My body could give my father more time. I thought that would be the hardest part. I was wrong about that, the same way I was wrong about a lot of things back then. The afternoon everything really began. I was not even in the room, but my Aunt Odette was, and she has told me the story so many times that I can see it. It was a Saturday in February, at the kitchen table on Rodman Street. The transplant coordinator had called to schedule Amber's testing, since I had already matched, and the team wanted a backup donor evaluated as well. Amber sat there with her coffee, and she did not even pretend to think about it. "I am not doing that," she said. "I have a body I actually like. Cristina already matched, so why would I cut myself open for nothing?" My aunt said the whole room went quiet. My father was in the next room and did not hear it. My mother heard it, and my mother said nothing, because in our family Amber was never asked to sacrifice anything. She was only ever asked what she wanted. That sentence, "I am not doing that," is the true center of this whole story, and only 3 people ever heard it, and one of them would spend the next 2 months pretending it was never said. What haunts me is not only that she said it, but that saying it cost her absolutely nothing. Nobody scolded her. Nobody even looked surprised. My mother refilled Amber's coffee and changed the subject to the wedding my sister was already planning, to a man she had been dating for 8 months. That was the arithmetic of our house. My willingness was expected, so it was invisible. Her refusal was accepted, so it was forgotten. And somewhere in that same week, my mother began telling the neighbors that both her girls were being so brave about their father, as if bravery could be split evenly between the one who volunteered and the one who walked away. So I was the donor. There was never really another option, and I made my peace with that. And I told myself it did not matter who else was willing, because my father was going to live. The surgery was scheduled for the 14th of March, at the transplant center at Rhode Island Hospital in Providence. In the weeks before, I did everything the way I do everything, quietly and completely. I filled out the living donor paperwork. I signed the consent forms. I saved the donor evaluation summary and the surgeon's letter to my own email, out of pure habit, the same habit that had paid my rent for 14 years. People imagine that donating a kidney is one surgery and a scar, but the truth is that it is months of proving you are worthy of the risk. I gave 11 vials of blood in a single morning. I lay inside a machine that photographed my organs from the inside. I sat across from a transplant psychologist who asked me, very gently, whether anyone was pressuring me, and I said no, because the pressure in my family had never once needed to be spoken out loud. I drove myself to every appointment. I sat in every waiting room alone. And the whole time, back on Rodman Street, The phone kept ringing with relatives calling to praise Amber for being such a rock. But somewhere in those weeks, a different story started growing in my mother's mouth, and I was too busy preparing to give up an organ to notice it taking root. Because Amber had made 2 phone calls to the transplant office, and because Amber had once driven our father to a consultation when I had the flu, my mother began telling people that Amber was the one handling everything. Amber is taking care of her father, she told my Aunt Gilda. She told the women at Santo Cristo. She told the pharmacist on Bedford Street. My name never came up. The donor never came up. It was as if the kidney was simply going to arrive by miracle, and Amber had kindly arranged the delivery. There was one morning that still sits in my chest. It was late February, and I had driven my father to dialysis at 5:30, and I sat in that waiting room for 4 hours reading claim denials on my laptop so I would not fall behind at work. When I finally brought him home, Amber was at the kitchen table with my mother, and there was a plate of malasadas from the bakery on Columbia Street between them, and my mother looked up at me and said, "Oh good, you are here. Amber has been telling me all about the transplant." Amber smiled at me over her coffee. She had never once set foot in the center. She did not know what floor it was on, but she had been telling my mother all about it, and my mother believed every word, because believing Amber was the one thing my mother had always been good at. That was the shape of the whole year. I learned the names of every nurse at the center on North Main Street. I learned which chair my father liked, the one by the window, and I learned to bring him a second pair of socks, because the machine always left him cold. I rearranged my hours at the clinic so I could be there. I did his grocery shopping. I refilled his prescriptions. I sat with him through the low blood pressure spells that left him gray and shaking in the chair. And every single time I did one of those things, it vanished the moment it was done, the way water closes over a stone, while anything Amber did, however small, was held up to the light and admired. On the morning of the surgery, my father and I were taken into the operating area an hour apart. Amber did not come to the hospital. She sent me one text at 6:40 in the morning, a single line, "Good luck, sis." And then she posted a photo of herself at a cafe in Providence, with the caption, "Hardest day of my life, praying for my dad." 200 people commented under it. Strangers she had never met called her strong. I read it later, from the recovery floor, with a line in my arm and a fresh scar where my left kidney used to be, and I laughed, because the alternative was something I was not ready to feel yet. If you have ever done the quiet, unglamorous work of holding a family together, only to watch someone else collect the applause for it, tell me in the comments what that felt like, because I have a feeling I am not the only one who has eaten dinner while a room toasted the wrong person. I woke up in a recovery bay at 2 in the afternoon, and the first thing I did, before I even asked about myself, was ask the nurse whether my father's new kidney had started working. She smiled, and she told me it had begun producing urine on the table almost immediately, which is the very best sign there is. I cried then, finally, from relief and from the drugs, and from something I did not have a word for. 2 floors above me, my father was waking up to the news that his daughter had saved his life. Nobody thought to tell him which daughter, and by the time the anesthesia had worn off enough for anyone to explain it to him, my mother had already chosen the version of events she preferred. The recovery was harder than anyone had warned me. For the first 2 weeks I could not drive. I could not lift anything heavier than a gallon of milk, and I could not straighten all the way up without the incision pulling. So I stayed in my apartment on Eastern Avenue, and I healed, and I called my father every single day, and I did not go to the Rodman Street house, because I physically could not manage those stairs. And that absence a surgeon had ordered, became the next brick in the story my mother was building. She told people I had disappeared. She told my father that Cristina was nowhere to be found, while your other daughter never left your side. Amber visited me exactly once during those weeks. She came to my apartment on a Sunday, stayed for 11 minutes, took a photo of herself sitting on the edge of my couch with a caption about family being everything, and left before I could even finish the tea I had struggled to make. I did not yet know what she was doing at the Rodman Street house on all the other days. I only knew that I was healing alone, and that the phone calls from my mother had taken on a new sharpness, a way of listing everything Amber was doing, as if she were reading me an invoice for love that I had somehow failed to pay. What Amber never left was the paperwork. My father came home from the hospital grateful, exhausted and heavily medicated, on oxycodone for the pain, and on prednisone that made his mind foggy for weeks. In that fog, over the course of about 10 days, my sister, the real estate agent, sat with him at the kitchen table and explained that the family needed to protect the house, God forbid something happened, and that the smart thing, the modern thing, was to add her name to the deed and to his credit union accounts, so that she could manage everything for him. She brought in a notary she knew from her office, a man named Dennis, who signed off without asking my father a single hard question. On the 2nd of April, my father, 3 weeks out from major surgery and full of painkillers, signed a quitclaim deed, adding Amber as a joint owner of the Rodman Street house, and signed a form making her a joint holder on an account with $41,000 in it, the savings of 40 years of cutting metal. 3 days after that signature, on the 5th of April, the family gathered for what my mother called a thank God dinner, a celebration that my father had survived. My Aunt Odette cooked for 2 days straight, 30 relatives packed into the Rodman Street house, and at the head of the table my mother stood up and lifted her glass and gave the toast you already heard, the one that thanked the daughter who had refused to be tested, and said nothing of the daughter sitting there with staples still in her side. I want to tell you I felt rage in that moment. I did not. I felt something colder and clearer than rage. I felt the exact moment a person stops hoping to be chosen by people who were never going to choose her. And in that clarity, I made a decision that had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with the truth. I was going to stop protecting a story that had never once protected me. The deed did not stay secret, because deeds are public, and I am a woman who reads records for a living. 4 days after the toast, a property revaluation notice arrived at my father's mailbox, and my aunt, who collects his mail, saw 2 names printed where there had always been one. She called me that night, her voice shaking, and she read the second name to me. Amber Medeiros, joint owner. I sat at my kitchen table on Eastern Avenue, and I did not move for a long time. Then I did what I always do. I started pulling documents. For one long night, I considered doing all of this quietly. I could have taken the deed to my father alone, in his kitchen, and spared everyone the scene. But I had spent my whole life being the daughter who handled things quietly, who kept the peace, who let the story stand so that dinner would not be ruined. And keeping quiet was exactly how a lie had been allowed to grow for 20 years, until it could walk into a hospital and sign its name to my father's house. The quiet was the problem. So this time, I chose a room with witnesses in it. I went to the Bristol County Registry of Deeds the next morning, and I paid for a certified copy of the quitclaim, dated the 2nd of April. I printed the surgeon's letter that named me, Cristina Medeiros, as the living kidney donor, dated the 14th of March. I printed the full donor evaluation. I printed Amber's text from the morning of the surgery, and the cafe photo with its 200 comments, and the caption, "Praying for my dad." Then I sat with my Aunt Odette at her kitchen table on the 1st floor, and I asked her one question. If it came to it, would she tell the whole family, out loud, what Amber had said that Saturday in February? She took my hand, and she said, "I have been waiting 2 months for someone to ask me that." I took the papers to a lawyer on North Main Street, a quiet man named Arthur who handled elder matters, and he read everything twice, and then he told me the truth in plain words. A quitclaim, signed by a heavily medicated man, 3 weeks after major surgery, arranged by the very person it benefited, notarized by that person's own colleague, was not a strong deed. It was a challenge waiting to happen. He said the house could very likely be restored to my father alone, and the account frozen and returned. But he said one more thing that stayed with me. He said, "The law can fix the deed, but only your family can decide what to do with the truth, and that part is yours." My sister's engagement dinner was 6 days after the toast, at a restaurant on Davil Street. Her fiancé, Ryan Willett, a paramedic who had spent his whole adult life pulling strangers out of wrecked cars, would be there. So would the same 30 relatives. I called the restaurant, and I reserved my own seat, and I told no one what I was planning to bring. The restaurant on Davil Street had a private room in the back, with a long table and a wall of windows facing the water. My sister wore a white dress, because to Amber, every dinner was a wedding she was the center of. My mother sat at her right hand, glowing. Ryan sat beside Amber, quiet and kind, and he was the only person in that room who stood up to pull out a chair for me when I walked in slowly, one hand pressed to my side. The dinner went the way those dinners always went. My mother toasted the engagement. She toasted Amber's bright future. And then, because she could not help herself, she raised her glass one more time, to the daughter who saved this family. And around the table the relatives smiled and nodded, and my father, thinner now but healing, looked down at his plate. I stood up. I did it slowly, because standing up quickly still hurt, and I said, in a voice that did not shake, that before we toasted anyone for saving my father, the family should probably know who actually did. The room went quiet. My mother told me to sit down. I did not sit down. I reached into the folder I had brought with me, and I began to set papers on the table, one at a time, the way I have set claims in front of insurance auditors for 14 years. I put down the surgeon's letter first. "This is dated the 14th of March. I said. "It names the living donor who gave Dad a kidney. The name on it is mine." I put down the donor evaluation. I put down the hospital wristband I had kept in a drawer. I put down Amber's text from that morning, "Good luck, sis," and beside it her photo from the cafe, praying for my dad, 200 comments deep. While I was on an operating table in Providence, I said. My sister was posting about her hardest day, from a coffee shop. Nobody at the table was smiling anymore. My Aunt Gilda, who had spent 2 months telling the parish that Amber was a saint, put her hand over her mouth. A cousin at the far end of the table quietly turned his phone face down. My mother's glass was still raised, halfway to a toast that no longer had anywhere to go, and slowly, she lowered it back down to the tablecloth without drinking. I was not finished. I told them what the letter did not say. I told them that I would live the rest of my life with one kidney, that I could never donate again, that I would carry a small risk in my body forever, so that my father would not have to die at 66. I did not say it for sympathy. I said it because for 2 months, a room full of people had let themselves believe that saving a life was something you could do with 2 phone calls and a photograph, and somebody in this family finally needed to say out loud what it actually costs. Then I put down the certified deed. "This one is dated the 2nd of April. I said. 3 weeks after the surgery, it adds Amber to the deed of this family's house. Dad signed it while he was on oxycodone and prednisone. Amber arranged it, and it was notarized by a man from Amber's own office. I put down the account form, $41,000, both of their names. My father lifted his head. He looked at the deed, and then he looked at Amber, and I watched a man who had just survived kidney failure slowly understand that he had signed away something he did not even remember agreeing to. He picked up the deed with both hands, the way he used to pick up my report cards, and he read his own signature at the bottom of it, and I watched his jaw work as he tried to remember the day he had written it. He could not. That is the real cruelty of what she did, that she chose the exact window of time when his mind was at its softest, when he would have signed a wall if she had told him it kept the family safe. He set the paper back down. He said my sister's name once. Only once. Amber. And there was a whole ocean of grief inside it. Amber found her voice the way she always did, loud and wounded. She said I was jealous. She said I was ruining her engagement out of pure spite. She said she had done everything for Dad. Everything, while I hid in my apartment. And for 1 second, because she is very good at this, the table wavered. Then my Aunt Odette stood up, 70 years old, in the same cardigan she wears to Mass, and her voice did not waver either. I was there, she said. In February, at the kitchen table, when the hospital called to test you, Amber, and you said, I am not doing that. You said, why would I cut myself open for nothing? I heard you. God heard you, and I have carried it for 2 months. The white dress did not have an answer for that. For a moment, Amber tried to laugh, the small disbelieving laugh she used whenever a room started slipping away from her. She looked to my mother for rescue, the way she had looked to her for 30 years, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched my mother fail to save her. My mother did not stand. My mother did not speak. She only stared at the certified deed lying on the tablecloth, and whatever story she had been telling herself for 2 months finally cracked in front of every person she had ever told it to. Ryan Ouellette set his fork down very carefully. He is a man who has knelt on wet pavement and pushed on the chests of strangers to keep them breathing, and I think, of everyone in that room, he understood the fastest what it meant to lie about saving a life. He turned to Amber, and he asked her one thing, quietly. Is any of it true? And Amber, who had an answer for everything, did not answer him. He waited. He gave her every second she needed, the way he must wait over people on the worst day of their lives, and when the silence answered for her, he stood up, and he lifted his jacket off the back of his chair. He did not shout. He simply said that he could not marry someone who would let a dying man believe a lie about his own life, and then he walked out of the private room, and the door closed behind him with a soft click that was somehow louder than any slammed door I have ever heard. My father stood up next, slowly, both hands flat on the table. He walked around to my chair, and he put his hand on the back of my neck, the way he used to when I was small, and in front of 30 relatives and a room gone completely silent, he said the only thing I had ever needed to hear him say. I am alive because of you, and I did not even know. I am sorry, my daughter. He turned to the whole table then, still with his hand on my shoulder, and he said it again, louder, so that no one could pretend later that they had not heard it. This one gave me a kidney, he said. This one drove me to dialysis at 5 in the morning for a year, and I let your mother tell me a story, because the story was easier than the truth, and I am ashamed of that. He looked at Amber last of all. He did not yell at her. He only said, You let me sign my house away while I was too sick to know my own name, and I do not know who taught you that, but it was not me. And that was the toast I had waited my whole life for, and it did not come with a raised glass. It came with a shaking hand and the plain truth. Around the table, one by one, the relatives who had lifted their glasses to my sister lowered their eyes. Nobody toasted anyone after that. The private room with its wall of windows stayed silent, except for the sound of my father breathing, and the small wet sound I made, trying not to cry into a plate of food I had never once touched. What happened after did not happen by magic. It happened by paperwork and by choices, the way real consequences always do. My father called the lawyer on North Main Street the very next morning. Within 6 weeks, the quitclaim was challenged and undone, and the Rodman Street house was in my father's name alone again, exactly as it had been for 46 years. The $41,000 went back into an account with only his name on it. The notary from Amber's office was reported to the state, and a man who would sign anything for a friend learned that some signatures follow you home. Amber's engagement did not survive the month. Ryan Ouellette is not the kind of man who builds a life on a woman who would take credit for a stranger's kidney and a sick man's savings, and he ended it cleanly, without cruelty, which was somehow harder on her. The relatives who had toasted her at 2 different dinners grew quiet around her. The real estate office where she worked did not keep an agent whose name had ended up in the paper next to the word quitclaim. Within a year, she had moved into a rented apartment across the line in Somerset, and the miracle child my mother had promised the whole parish never did buy anyone a house. My mother is the part that still aches. She never really apologized, because to apologize, she would have to admit that 20 years of choosing one daughter had built the exact ruin she was now sitting inside of. She lost the most, in the end, and she lost it slowly, the way you lose a thing you refuse to admit you were ever holding too tightly. My father lived. That is the part I hold on to. The kidney I gave him works, and he grows stronger every month, and on Sunday mornings he drives himself now, to the same church where my mother once told everyone that Amber was taking care of him. He comes to my apartment on Eastern Avenue for coffee, and he tells me about his week, and once, only once, he cried at my kitchen table and told me he had spent his whole life mistaking the loud daughter for the loving one. I told him we did not have to talk about it. He said, "No, we do, because you deserve to hear it out loud, and you have waited long enough for anything true to be said out loud in this family." Here is what I learned, and I am telling you because I think some of you needed to hear the same thing I finally did. Being the reliable one is not the same as being the loved one, and you are allowed to stop auditioning for people who decided a long time ago that you were furniture. I gave my father a kidney, and I would do it again tomorrow, but I gave it because I loved him, not because I was trying to earn a seat at a table that kept toasting someone else. The love has to be the reason. The moment it becomes a payment you are hoping will finally be accepted, you have already lost more than an organ. I do not speak to my sister anymore, and I have made my peace with that. Family is not the people who share your blood, and your last name, and your grandmother's house. Family is the people who will tell the truth about you in a crowded room, when telling it costs them something. My Aunt Odette, 70 years old in her mass cardigan, is my family. My father, at long last, is my family. And the quiet daughter who kept every document and never once raised her voice turned out to be the only person at that table who could not be erased. Because you cannot toast a lie forever, and the truth, once you set it down on the table one page at a time, does not get up and leave. It just sits there, patient, until every last person in the room finally has to look at it.